We know that plant health is very important to our soil health. And if we don't have good plant and soil health, we know that we can't capture rainfall when we do finally get some. So in this result demonstration, we'll be looking at different measurements you can take on pastures to get an idea about how well your plants are established and what that means for rainfall infiltration, or how much water you actually get when we do finally receive that rainfall. You may have heard about take half, leave half. This is where you purposely leave at least half of your grass plant standing after you graze in order to keep healthy plant roots, which break up the ground and allow rainfall to infiltrate. It's also shading out the ground to create a much cooler temperature underneath. There's that stubble left that's going to provide really good cover for wildlife. Lots of benefits to leaving that 50% stubble. Now that's directly related to rainfall infiltration. We know that when we get 1 inch of rainfall, if our land has not been properly cared for, we're not going to see an inch of rainfall actually infiltrate into an area that our plants can use. And if it goes into that substrate moisture to prolong the plants, we know that we're going to subsist through that drought much better. So let's look at some ways that we can see how our plant and soil characteristics may influence rainfall infiltration. Our example ranch today is in Bexar County. They've been kind enough to let us come to their place and look at 3 different conditions of land that they have currently after a 2-year drought, to let us look at differences amongst their pastures and easy things that you can measure.
My name is Marilyn Magara, and my sister and I, Joan Salcedo, we operate the Back 40 Ranch. The ranch has been in the family since the early 1900s. Actually, the family settled here in the late 1890s. It's a long, skinny piece of property. It runs from the highway all the way down to the San Antonio River, which is a little over 3 miles long. So it's not very wide, but it sure is long. With such a long, skinny place, it's kind of hard to try to keep feed and everything for the animals up and growing, especially when we're hitting some of these droughts.
There are several ways that we can measure the plant and soil in these 3 different pastures to determine potential rainfall infiltration and overall health. First, we'll determine plant cover by using a meter square made of PVC in several representative locations in the pasture, recording how much of the frame is made up of grasses, forbs, litter, or bare ground. Next, we'll look at plant health by digging up and measuring the roots on some of the better forage grass plants from a representative area in the pasture. Root length determines how deep in the soil profile the plant can reach nutrients and those water resources. Soil moisture can be determined using a Lincoln soil moisture tool at 3 inches and 6 inches deep. The tool must be calibrated at full saturation, which would be a 10 on the scale, with that soil type before measurements are taken. Next, soil temperature can be measured a 1/4 inch below the soil surface using a soil thermometer. More plant coverage will usually keep the soil cooler, favoring microbes and water retention. Finally, water infiltration speed is compared between pastures by hammering a metal or PVC ring into the ground a couple of inches to hold the water. A known amount of water will be poured into the ring. We use 16 ounces, but use whatever makes sense for the size of your ring. Time how long it takes for all the water to fully infiltrate where no more water is sitting on the soil surface. Welcome to the Back 40 Ranch. We'll be performing all of the different measurement techniques covered in the methods for the sacrifice pasture, the moderately grazed pasture, and the lightly grazed pasture. We'll demonstrate each method and provide a summary of the results at the end of each section. First up, let's estimate ground cover in each of the 3 pastures using a 1 meter square frame, and we'll estimate the coverage of grasses, forbs, brush, litter, and bare ground. On the sacrifice pasture, where cattle have been parked for a long period of time eating hay, we only had 25% grass, 69.5% litter, and very little bare ground forbs or brush. The moderately grazed pasture fared a little bit better with 60% grass, 30% bare ground, and 10% litter. Finally, the lightly grazed pasture had 45% grass and almost equal amount of litter at 40%. There were no forbs or brush, and bare ground was only 15%. You can see in summary that the moderately and light grazed pastures maintained a much higher amount of grass coverage on the land, which makes for a lot better infiltration of that rainfall due to the root system breaking up the soil and helping that water to get back in. You can also see that on the lightly grazed pasture, we maintained a high percent of litter on the ground, which also can help to shade that open bare ground from sun, which might evaporate any water or moisture that does reach it. Each of these percentages were averaged from 4 different meter square frames that we laid across each of the 3 pastures. Next up, we'll be measuring our grass height with a measuring stick. This could help us to understand how well those grasses are able to slow down any rainfall and get them to go into the ground with their root health. Our results are as we would expect. Our sacrifice pasture, where those animals have been parked for a period of time, only had 2 to 3 inches of grass height, moderately grazed 6 to 8 inches, and the lightly grazed pasture still had 10 to 12 inches of grass height, meaning that they had a lot more plant material left above ground and probably very healthy roots below ground. Next, we use the soil moisture meter to determine our soil moisture at 3 inches and 6 inches deep. This will tell us how much water is available to plants after recent rainfalls.
We're in an exceptional drought here on the south end of Bexar County and here around Elmendorf, and we had about an inch of rain here 2 days ago. And that's the last substantial rain we got in this part of the county was early spring, and so we've been awfully dry. But you can tell we've got a pretty sandy loam type soil profile here, it feels like, and you can tell that as I kind of dug down here that there is some moisture.
In summary, our soil moisture meter measured a 2 in the lightly grazed and moderately grazed pastures at 6 inches deep, which means that they did capture a little bit of that 1 inch of rainfall that was recently received, whereas our sacrifice pasture did not seem to capture any of it. At a more shallow level, 3 inches deep, we did see a tiny bit of soil moisture for the sacrifice pasture at a 1, but maintain that level of 2 in the moderately and light grazed pastures. Next up, we'll look at measuring root depth and length. This is going to help us to understand those plant conditions, the health of the plant, the resilience of the grass, and the ability of that grass to be opening up that soil in order for rainfall to infiltrate properly.
At the top of my hand here would be the area of the grass that's kind of above the soil surface. So you've got some areas in here where we've got roots that are anywhere from 3 to 6 inches in length. Folks, we're in another pasture here out on the back 40, and it looks like we're in we call this kind of a moderately grazed pasture. We've got quite a bit more canopy height out here in this particular pasture. I've just pulled up a little cross section here, and so if we kind of take our measuring stick again and we look in terms of an area that has a little bit more top growth in it, a little bit better canopy height, and then we correlate that to the root system, I hope you can see, but we've got some roots here that are in essence, you know, that longest one there is 15 inches, but I would say the balance of these are somewhere in that 8 to 10 inch length. So definitely, I think, a correlation between the amount of grass that we've got on top of the ground and much more extensive root system in this particular pasture. Okay, we've got an area here in a better pasture. I feel like it looks like we've got a couple of bulls and a donkey in here at the moment, but we've got quite a bit more grass. Again, I mentioned earlier we had an inch rain here recently, here just a couple of days ago, and you can already see things really starting to respond to that moisture. Watch out here, fella. But if we kind of come and we take a look here, we can see some roots, and I'd say most of these, again, are in that 5 to 7 inch range. But one thing that's interesting about this in particular is there just seems to be quite a bit more root system. They seem to be a little bit more concentrated, as you just kind of pull up this section here.
So in summary, our Bermuda grass pastures had very different root lengths depending on which pasture we were in. That poor sacrifice pasture where the cattle had been for some time had only 3 to 6 inch roots, whereas our lightly grazed pasture had 5 to 7 inches, but much more bulk or more amount of roots visible. And our moderately grazed pasture had 8 to 10 inches for their root system. So they're going to be able to reach much more nutrients and soil moisture for the long term than our sacrifice pasture. Next, we're going to measure the soil temperature just a 1/4 inch below the soil surface. These temperatures did not vary wildly between the sacrifice moderately grazed or lightly grazed pastures, anywhere from 88 degrees underneath that thick thatch of litter in the sacrifice pasture to 92 or 90 degrees in the moderately grazed and light grazed pastures. But note that where we measured bare ground, it averaged about 101 degrees Fahrenheit. So we know that that is a really, really high temperature that might have some effect on our microbial activity in the soils and be a direct link between being able to get more plants established there in the future where we've got that bare ground. And now we're going to measure infiltration rate directly. Remember, that's where we're going to put a ring into the soil. We're going to pour a known amount of water in there and time how fast it takes for that water to soak into the soil. When we have healthier soils, water should infiltrate faster, indicating better soil structure and porosity. In contrast, slower infiltration rates in other pastures may suggest compacted or degraded soil.
Okay, we've got our container here. We've got 16 ounces of water, and I'm going to go ahead and measure the amount of time it's going to take for this water to go ahead and infiltrate into the soil profile. And our intent is to drive this container down deep enough in the ground where we don't have any water leaking out the side of it. And so I don't see any water leaking out the side, but you can notice that there's still quite a bit of water it's standing on top of the soil surface here. So we'll give it some time to see how long it'll take for it all to infiltrate into the ground. Alright, so we've got another 16 ounces of water, and we're going to pour it in here. We've got this canister kind of tapped into the ground here, about an inch to an inch or so in the ground. And what we're going to do is I'm going to time the amount of time that it takes for this 16 ounces of water to infiltrate into the soil profile. So we're going to go ahead and start our clock, and we're just going to put this water in here. And the reason we tap this container in the ground is we don't want any water leaking out of the perimeter of it, but we want to illustrate, and if you can see on film, you'll notice that the water is really going into the ground at a much faster pace than what we saw at the previous site where there really wasn't much grass. And I think a lot of that had to do with just that sacrifice area where they've been feeding cattle. There was some compaction going on and probably a number of issues. A lot more litter in that area, and that maybe slowed some of that infiltration rate. But We're approaching a minute right now, and as you can tell, I can see, at least from my angle, that water has gone down pretty substantial in a relatively short amount of time. So the thought is that maybe with a little bit more grass cover and a little bit more canopy height out here, we can do a little bit better job of capturing some water and catching some water when we do get a rainfall event. We've got a random site here selected. We're going to go ahead and put our 16 ounces of water in here and see how long it takes for it to go ahead and infiltrate into the profile.
In summary, though it was hard to see that water level in the film, we did notice that there was a significant difference between the amount of time that it takes for rainfall to infiltrate in that sacrifice pasture versus the moderately or lightly grazed pasture. So you can see that there was almost 4 minutes for sacrifice pasture and about 1.5 minutes for the lightly grazed pasture. What this means is that when we get rainfall, some of these pastures are going to be able to soak in that water much more quickly without allowing it to run off, and others are going to struggle to keep any of that soil moisture retained, which we did see when we measured that soil moisture at 6 inches and 3 inches. Just not a lot of retention there in that sacrifice pasture, and that's likely why it's just running off of that land and we're not capturing it. We want to stage our properties to make sure that we're capturing that rainfall when we do finally get it.
Well, as we wrap things up today, I just want to share a couple of key points. First being that our lightly grazed pasture had the most grass canopy height at 10 to 12 inches. It also really had a very dense and healthy root system, which really supports water infiltration. In essence, our findings really support other extension studies and research work that's been done that shows that grass stubble has a direct correlation to a higher infiltration rate and plant growth. I guess the second point that I would like to share would be that our sacrifice pasture had very little standing forage. We had quite a bit of litter and some forbs in there, and it took the longest water infiltration time. I want you to think about if we happen to have had a really hard rain. Most of that water would have never made it into the soil profile. Most of that would have run off and taken a lot of soil with it. So when we get into these areas where we don't have a lot of grass and we have a lot of compaction, just understand that you may get an inch rain or a 2-inch rain, but the amount of that is going into the soil profile is a very small percentage of that. So the take-home message in essence would be that by practicing good land stewardship and pasture management principles, and by not overgrazing your pastures, you can capture more water and grasses will respond quite a bit faster once you receive a rainfall event.